Welcome to Hot Science. This is Richard Clarke with the week's top news in science, technology, and medicine. And
We lost your audio.
okay, well, actually, to review the stories for the week, first we have the story on the COP27 conference, and the UN Secretary General says the world is heading for a climate catastrophe as companies fail to deliver. And then in areas that are related to this delivery, the EU has approved their ban on new combustion engine cars in 2035. So they're trying to really push the swing in automotive energy systems. And then related to that is an article on a reckoning for EV battery materials, because to do what the automakers are planning to do, we have to increase battery production in the next few years by a factor of 10. The next story is another environmental story, and an Oxford University says that switching to renewables could save trillions of dollars. Then in materials, scientists have discovered a material that can be made easily like plastic, but conducts like a metal. It also is more robust than the kind of doped metals that you get nowadays in things like semiconductors, so it's more tolerant to heat and moisture and environmental things that cause problems with other connectors. Then in space, we have an image just for Daryl, and it's an image that shows the spectacular aftermath after a large star's death. And in our animal story, we have a story about bumblebees. It turns out the bumblebees like to play with wooden balls, like people and dogs. I don't think they play catch, though. We'll have a video of the bumblebees playing with the balls. And the human story, I've been talking about problems in China and China's birth rate. Now, when the Chinese find out a couple has been married, they start to get phone calls saying, "Dear newlywed, when is the baby arriving?" So I think things are different in the Chinese population control from the days of the one-child policy. And then I have a couple of medical stories. One is of the next round of COVID. Now they're not talking about individual variants. They're talking about a COVID variant soup, a bunch of variants that are coming together, and this is going to make the winter surges harder to predict because it's taking on a new course. And then also with a COVID story, China has started using the first inhalable COVID-19 vaccine. This is taken by mouth. There also are vaccines they're working on that are taken by nose. What they believe is they'll get vaccinations for people who are afraid of needles, and it's also easier to apply, and it may give better immunity at the place where the infection starts, which is with the nose and the respiratory system. So, heading into the stories now, the UN Secretary General says the world is facing, quote, economy destroying levels of global heating, which is a pretty severe statement. And he says the world is heading for climate catastrophe, and their latest report shows how far off track nations are on cutting global warming pollution. The report reveals a huge gap between the action needed to limit global temperature rises to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and what countries are doing and have pledged to do. That's different, of course. And the current climate policies put the world on track for warming in the next decade that would lead to long-term rises between 2.4 and 2.6 centigrade. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres labels this as a, quote, economy destroying levels of global heating. And they further say the time for incremental changes is over, and only a root and branch transformation of our economies and societies can save us from accelerating climate disaster. And this will require much faster changes to electricity supplies, industry, transport, and building, as well as protection of landscape, changing the diet and farming, extensive changes. Also, the financial system has to be reformed some way to provide the about $5 trillion a year that's needed for the next few years to enable this transformation. The world is already seeing floods and storms and heat waves and wildfires as a result of climate change, and we haven't even gotten to 1.5C yet. At 1.5C, they forecast more devastating weather extremes, crop damage, and losses in our natural systems. So countries are off track to achieve even their highly insufficient climate changes. They say we've had our chance to make incremental changes, but that time is over. It's tough, but still we must try. Every fraction of a degree matters at this point, and we must close the emission gaps before climate catastrophe closes in on us all. And this is as extreme of a report that I've ever heard from the UN. And what do you guys think? Sounds bad to me. You're muted, Andrew.
Yeah, it's all more alarmist nonsense. If anything, natural disasters like floods and storms and wildfires kill far fewer people nowadays than they did 100 years ago when populations were much smaller. And fossil fuels and energy production have improved disaster survival and lifted the majority of the world's much greater population out of poverty and food insecurity. And there's all kinds of evidence that says that the higher CO2 levels have actually increased food production.
I'm afraid what you're hearing about food production is absolutely incorrect. It looks like the higher CO2s may improve food production, but the higher heats deprove food production, so the net is a loss.
Well,
And in terms of the poppycock, ask the people in Bangladesh or in Pakistan or in China who went through the heat this summer if they thought that that was poppycock. So I think you, because of your own background, are misinterpreting real data that is out there.
well, the article said that we have to reduce carbon emissions by 45% in the next 8 years. And we've been talking about this for the last 20 years and it's gone up all the time. So-
And all we had to do was to develop the kind of renewable resources to the point where they can start to be deployed, and they're starting to be deployed now on a pretty massive scale. The question is, will it be enough to bend the curve? And it looks to me like the curve is going to be bent within the next 2 years. And by bending the curve, I mean get to the point where we are no longer putting more crap into the air. Thank you, Chad, for the curve.
What's the curve? What's the x-axis or the y-axis? Parts per million CO2. Yeah, we've doubled the CO2, and so far everything's a-okay, I figure.
Except, I think there are a lot of people that wouldn't agree with you. And the heat problems this year in the summer, for example, affected about 1 billion people in India, China, and Europe, among others. And I think that's a lot of people. It's more than I know.
Well, all that's true, but the reality is we just are not going to be able to get away from fossil fuels as quickly as all these people would believe, without starving millions of people, billions of people. So
certainly the transition is not easy. And, part of what has to happen in the transition is how many people's incomes and life is based on the work for internal combustion engines, one way or another. That's fossil fuel production plus the car manufacturers plus the car repair and support people. There are millions of people who are going to be out of jobs and need to change jobs as a part of the transition. It's not going to be easy.
Or quick.
I think it'll be faster than some think, but it still will not be quick.
What surprises me is that the politicians are all aware of the difficulty in moving away from fossil fuels, but they pander to the environmentalists and alarmists by passing these plans that they have no intention of implementing.
Well, if you're talking about what they're pandering to, they give billions of dollars still in fossil fuel subsidies, and they give a lot more money to fossil fuel subsidies than they do in building renewable resources. And to me, it seems like I heard this expression, follow the money. And if I want to look at what the politicians are pandering to, I pay a lot of attention to who they're giving the money to. And most of the money still goes to supporting fossil fuels.
That's because the fossil fuel industry is supporting the politics. it's a close ball game, and the public has very little to do with it.
Anyway, moving along on a related story, the EU has approved a ban on new combustion engine cars starting in 2035, and this was enacted by the European Union lawmakers and member countries to ban the sale of new gas and diesel cars by 2035. They have a significant incremental goal, which is to reduce the emission of new cars by 55% in 2030 as compared to 2021. So what they are trying to achieve is a 55% reduction in automobile use of fossil fuels. And in Europe, transportation is the only sector in which greenhouse gas emissions have increased for the last 30 years. And there they've increased by about 33%. Passenger cars, it turns out, are a major polluter, accounting for 61% of total CO2 emissions from road transports. So even though electrifying trucks has the most incremental benefit per truck, electrifying passenger cars is still the biggest percentage of the emissions. One of the problems that they have in Europe coming up is the region still lacks charging stations for that volume. And even with these goals, more aggressive organizations like Greenpeace says the 2035 deadline is too late to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees, and quote, the EU is taking the scenic route, and that route ends in disaster. They are saying new cars with internal combustion engines should be banned by 2028 at the latest.
And do you think that's going to happen?
No, especially not from Greenpeace. You were talking about these guys that are not in the center. Greenpeace is not in the center.
Well, and the article says that transportation carbon contributions in the EU are only 16% of the total.
Does that include air transportation?
But it's 16% you can get to.
I know, but so all those numbers you quote, like most of the increase has been from car increases, but cars are only 16% of the total. So they got an awful lot of other stuff that they're going to have to knock off to get down to the.
Do you think that means they shouldn't do what they can do because there's other stuff to do too? Is that what you're saying? I want to be clear on this. Because it sounds like you're saying they're doing the wrong thing, and they are doing one of the things that they can do.
But if their focus is really on carbon emissions, then it should be on trucks and buses.
But
automobiles that stay garaged for all but an hour a day really are not such big contributors.
But again, in the report from the EU says that passenger cars contribute 61% of the emission from these vehicles. And to me, 61% is bigger than 39%,
But even so, 61% of 16% is only about 8 or 9%. So
I'm still trying to find the 16% in the article. You may be right, but.
And I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that all
these. Well, again, it sounds like from the negativity in your argument as I hear you, it sounds like you're arguing against it. And what I want to know is if you're arguing against it, then what are you in favor of?
No, I'm not arguing against it. All I'm pointing out is that it can't happen as quickly as they say.
Sure, I believe you. I believe you're correct, and I believe that means that we are in trouble unless we figure out how to do everything that we can do on multiple fronts. I think that's what the UN guy was saying, you know, that the time for incremental change is past us, and if we want to do anything effective, we really have to start looking deeper and be more willing to do things that are disruptive.
I hear Andrew saying we should do more, and there is a lot more we can do.
Sure.
We can get rid of a lot of beef cattle. We can get rid of a lot of agriculture. A third of the emissions are from agriculture.
Right, that's still, we can do it. That's changing how people eat is more difficult than changing how people drive around and get to places.
I
We
agree,
need to
but there
tackle it
are
all.
ways to mediate some of the carbon, say from cows and steers, by varying their feed.
Sure, and we should do it. And now they have figured out in Australia how to be able to effectively grow the particular kind of algae as a crop, and had their first big harvest a few months ago. So now, going along still in that same area, one of the issues is with EV battery raw materials. And if we're going to do this stuff, what they are saying is that we're going to have to increase our production of batteries for these cars by a factor of more than 10 between now and 2030, which is real fast. We are seeing big increases in costs of materials. If you see here, nickel and lithium prices have been going up really steeply over the last year or so. They're leveling out now, but they're leveling out at a level that is 7 or 8 times higher than they used to be. These increased costs now are also trickling down into increasing costs for the vehicles. Trade frictions are also problems in the way, and the lithium and nickel development chains is lengthy and complex. They're difficult to extract. There's complicated refining. The intermediate steps between excavation and final assembly are a choke point. There's not enough capacity. Right now, China is the leader in material refining, and to get to where they need to get to, one of the things that they're nervous about is they're going to have to depend on a number of unfamiliar companies that are doing new roles in this business. So you're not only developing new production capacities, you're really developing new industries, new companies, stuff like that. And again, these are big changes. What Andrew is talking about is not easy, is, I think, understatement. And, they're trying to develop different relationships. Right now, if you look at dealing with nickel as one example, there are only 16 companies around the world that can perform the processes that are needed. 11 are maintained by China, and China has about 85% of the capacity in the world. In the case of lithium, China is also dominant in the supply of lithium raw material supply and processing operations. What the U.S. tried to do with the investment in the Inflation Reduction Act is they're trying to redress some of that and add capacity in the U.S., but still in this period, in the rest of the decade, China is going to be the capacity leader in at least two of the critical materials to make these batteries. So one part of the transition is adding the manufacturing and assembly and processing capacity, and another part is just making sure we have enough raw materials. So far, I really haven't heard any giant alarms on raw material supply, but like the article talks about, there are enough choke points in the process that you know it's not going to go smoothly.
And these big projects typically take 3 or 4 years to plan and lots of time to implement. So it's a good article that outlines the complexity, both physical and political, in getting these necessary materials. And anyone who thinks we can increase it tenfold in the next 10 years or 8 years isn't reading the article. Like, it's wishful thinking to imagine that we can increase that production tenfold in 8 years.
Well, we can do things fast when we have to. If you look at the mobilization of the U.S. for World War II, that didn't take 10 years.
No. Do you think that's what it's going to take?
I think to actually be effective of it, we're going to have to take a kind of mobilization that we haven't seen anywhere in the world. So that certainly frightens me. Again, I think it frightens the guys at the UN who are being so alarmist too. That's why my interest in the last year has opened up to adaptation in addition to, what we can do to stop it. The question, I think a lot of the question for the next 20 years is how do we adapt to the changes that are already in the pipeline? And that's a big deal. Just ask all those guys in Jakarta.
Something that quite a few car manufacturers are starting to look at, and I think this is the next step in the automotive industry, and that's the battery solar hybrid, where the solar panels will help charge your battery while you're driving, and it'll decrease the need for charging, which uses electricity, which uses plants and contributes to CO2. So I think that's coming up. That'll come up next. Will be the solar paneled EV. I don't know what that'll be called then. SBEV.
They'll figure out a moniker for it. The marketing guy's got to give it a name.
Right.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is the energy density of solar panels is so low that you need to have a car about, with several acres of roof to provide the necessary electricity to run the darn thing.
You're not thinking in the future, though. The solar panels have changed in the past just 5 years. They're probably about half the size they were 8 years ago anyway. So they're getting more efficient every year. Technology is working on that.
Yeah, so now they're 15% efficient, but the solar energy that's coming in hasn't changed, and it's, if anything, it's a little more than it was, but it's not enough to.
Well, we still have more than, I don't remember what the number is. I think it's 100 times more power coming in every day from the sun than we use on the planet. So it's not in the right place, of course. Not on top of the card. There are some places that have been dealing, I think in Venezuela, there is a trade in oil-rich Venezuela where they're taking things like golf carts and putting electric motors on them and solar panels on the top. So there's some small-scale stuff where they're doing what you're talking about, Chad. They don't go very far, very fast, but it's pretty cheap once you have it there.
There's a automobile company called Soco, something like that. Anyway, they make a popular car, the Scion, Scion. Anyway, they have a whole line of trucks, cars, buses with solar panels being used on them to help with the efficiency of the car.
Now, continuing the discussion about renewable energy, then an Oxford University study says switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy could save the world as much as $12 trillion by 2050. That's a lot of money. And here they're not talking about a cost, but a savings, a reduced cost. And so the report says it's wrong and pessimistic to claim that moving quickly towards cleaner energy sources was expensive. In fact, the researchers say that going green now makes economic sense because of the falling cost of renewables, which is what Chad was talking about. And they say, quote, even if you're a climate denier, you should be on board with what we're advocating. We should go full speed ahead with the green energy transition because it's going to save us money. The data from fossil fuels goes back from 2020 more than 100 years. And they say after accounting for inflation and market volatility, the price really hasn't changed much in 100 years. Renewables have been around for only a few decades, but in that time, the cost of solar and wind power have fallen rapidly at a rate approaching 10% a year, which is a lot better than not changing over the last 200 years. And they expect that the price of renewables will continue to fall, and they expect this based on their understanding using data about how massive investment and economies of scale have made other similar technologies cheaper. Scaling up green technologies, they say, will continue to drive their costs down, and the faster we go, the more we'll save. Wind and solar are already the cheapest option for new power projects, but questions still remain over how to best store power and balance the grid. And so they say the predictions that have been made about the cost of keeping global temperature rises under 2%, the prediction was that it means the world will lose GDP, and these predictions are too pessimistic. And when I read this, it makes me think of the spending money on ramping up renewables as an investment because it's going to give return later. It's not a cost where you just put money in a hole and never see it again. It's an investment and you'll get return on investment. And if we could start to see it that way, it would make it easier for us to do what we need to do.
There is financial accounting. There's also energy accounting. And it consumes tremendous energy for solar and wind compared to hydro.
But solar and wind is more available than hydro because we have a lot of land and water to put it on.
And if it is as attractive as these academics say, you can bet there'll be lots of greedy capitalists that'll get on board and go after it. So we should be just waiting for the greedy capitalists to buy into it, to take it over.
But it also turns out that there are times where governments can do something to help the greedy capitalists. Like, for example, Biden's IRA has encouraged companies both in the U.S. and around the world to come into the U.S. and invest billions of dollars in kind of new technology, new manufacturing companies in the U.S. because the government is supporting it. The same thing with government action on the cars in Europe. So the government can press their finger on the scale and change the balance.
Yeah, they support it with tax breaks and that sort of thing.
That's money. Tax breaks is money, right?
Yeah.
So they support it with money.
Yeah. The other
and
thing
capitalists like money.
And we all know that governments are much better at spending money than they are at making money. And so many government investments have turned sour because they weren't founded on proper economic principles.
And a lot of them have turned out great also, like the investment in America in Social Security. So government is not always a failure, even though the Republicans would like you to think it is. How many people here are Americans getting income from Social Security?
I paid a lot of money into Social Security, and that pension fund that the government manages, Social Security, is helping me now. But it sure cost me a lot when I was working.
Right, me too, and I'm glad I paid into it, and I wish now I had been able to pay in more. In my consulting days, I tried to limit how much Social Security I paid because it's income, and now I wish I had paid more into it.
And it was pre-tax income.
Right, anyway.
And Social Security isn't actually funded from the return on the investments. The Social Security premiums are just used in general revenue, and general revenue is used to pay out the...
But it is a government program, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just end the discussion there. Government programs can be beneficial. They're not all beneficial, but they can be beneficial, and a lot of them have been. Okay, the next is a material story, and the scientists have discovered a new material that can be made like a plastic, but conducts like a metal. And this was done by scientists at the University of Chicago. And the research shows how to make a kind of material where the molecular fragments are jumbled and disordered, but they are still a good conductor of electricity. And part of it is this goes against all of the rules and all of what we understand about a conductor, what we know about the metal conductors and then the kind of doped semiconductor conductors is that they all have their electrons organized in neat little rows, and we thought before that's what is required to make a conductor. And in the case of these plastic things, the material is all jumbled up. They don't really know how it works. It's against any of the theories they have. They are kind of guessing that within the jumbled up structure there are plates that make contact, and those plates become the thing that allows it to be a conductor. But the thing about this material is it's a whole new class of material, easy to shape, very robust in everyday conditions. And if you're going to make electronic devices, you have to have conductors. What we have now are metals like copper, gold, and aluminum. And then about 50 years ago, we started to develop conductors made from doped organic materials where they dope them with atoms or electrons to make them conductive. These materials are not very stable. They lose conductivity exposed to moisture or heat or other things. And this material, this plastic material, is not affected particularly by heat or moisture or even acids or other things that are crummy. They said they heated it, they chilled it, exposed it to air and humidity. They even dripped acid and bases on it, and nothing happened. And this is very useful if you're going to make a device that has to fit and work in the real world. And so this makes the ideas for making electronic devices a lot different. One of the things, again, the ability to do it and make the conductor at room temperature, where even when you're making it and putting it together, you don't have to apply heat, makes the thing much more robust, much more reliable. And, if you need a device that withstands heat, acid, alkalinity, or humidity, now you will be able to use this material to make those kind of devices. So this is a kind of development that is going to spread out the application of electronic devices even more broadly. And I think it's cool because they did it using some approach that was just out of left field, because they thought before that something like this just wouldn't work because it does not fit with what they understood about how electricity flows through material. And to have some crazy scientist try out some other idea and discover some new material, to me, is exciting and an example of good science.
Yeah, it's really good news that they can do this, and it's probably more for electronic type signals, really low power type applications rather than high power applications.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the current handling capabilities. That's always often the limiting factor.
And it's like superconductivity. They talk about achieving superconductivity at ambient temperatures. That would be really something if they could make that happen.
Right. Okay, now we're going to move along to the kind of story that some of us like. The image that you're seeing there is an image of after the explosive death of a massive star. This is in the Milky Way, about 800 light years from Earth, in the constellation or direction of the constellation Vela. I don't know where that is. We need somebody with more expertise than me on that. And the image shows clouds of gas covering an expanse roughly 600 times larger than our solar system. And this image shows supernova remnants that are about 11,000 years old. Okay, I'm trying to get, and the astronomers say the beauty of these kind of images is we can see what material was inside the star from the gases that are remaining. These supernovae produce many elements, including calcium or iron or oxygen, I believe, that we use in our body. And so the supernovae are a spectacular part of the evolution of stars and the evolution of life on our planet. The star itself has been reduced in the aftermath of the supernova that it had at the end of its life. Then it changed into an incredibly dense spinning object called a pulsar. And a pulsar is a kind of a neutron star. And finally, it just got so dense that it went blowy. And here, 11,000 years later, we see the picture of this swirl of gases that is 600 times bigger than our solar system. Again, one of the things I love about astronomy is it's so big and there's so much energy. It just blows my mind. I think there are other people here who have interest also in this kind of subject as well. Wouldn't you say, Daryl?
Oh, yeah. It was quite a picture. Especially, I was enthused with the equipment they used to take the picture. But they use a camera that's 268 million pixels.
Wow.
Yeah, and
wow.
The camera I use is 24 million pixels. And so that alone is just amazing. And plus it's a mosaic, which means it's many photographs stitched together.
Yes.
So it's just the numbers of pixels that is in this photograph is amazing. And they took it with the VLT, the Very Large Telescope in Chile. And that telescope alone, I don't know the exact size of it, but I believe it's a multi-mirror telescope.
Okay.
And just the equipment they used to take this, and they did take it from Earth. It's not a Webb or Hubble telescope. Amazing.
Is the color correct, or did they colorize it somehow?
No, that's the correct color. That's the correct color.
Okay. Now they said 4 filters were used, but the filters don't change the color, I guess. It just makes you see the color.
Right. They take photographs in red, green, blue filters, and then they stack.
They stack them together.
Integrate and stack each color, so it's an RGB type issue. So what you end up is a true color picture.
Right.
And the red is mostly because it's hydrogen.
Right. That's what it said in the article as well. So magenta, blue, green, and red were the filters.
Right.
Well,
the only disappointing part was they didn't mention the catalog number or the coordinates, by
Yes,
ascension or declination.
right.
Because I would love to try it myself.
Right, that's what I was waiting for, is you to tell us where it was.
Yeah, they don't mention what it is, the NGC number or
Right,
I
right,
really don't know.
Well, and presumably these colors are only that part of the radiation that's in the visible spectrum.
right,
There must
right.
be all manner of additional radiation that we don't record or don't see because it's outside the visible spectrum.
Yeah, that was one of the big parts of Webb, is that it's got powerful infrared detection. And so with the infrared, we can see stuff behind the lit up stars or galaxies, excuse me.
And those blue dots in the photo were actual stars behind this nebular cloud, presumably, that were shining
I
through
guess,
the glasses.
or in front.
Yeah, plus some of the filters that you use sometimes, depending upon the filter, you can get narrowband type filters, and that turns the stars a little magenta color.
Okay,
And some you can process some of that out to get the true colors of the stars, because there's catalogs out there that know the true catalogs of every one of those stars. And when processing, you can keep those colors in those stars without letting your filters change it.
okay,
Yeah, it's different techniques.
yes. I really appreciate that we have you on this call today, Daryl, particularly for this one, because this one you get to tell us about it and we get more insight into the process.
Yeah,
And like you say,
fun.
the process is amazing.
It is.
Okay, the next story is about bumblebees. And, you know, the thing about bumblebees is that we think that, excuse me, I got the wrong thing up here, that bumblebees live a life of work and toil, and it's not so much the case. Here, I'm just trying to adjust the screen here so I get the right thing on it. Excuse my. Okay, here we go. This is a video when it comes up of bumblebees playing with wooden balls. And they, studying this, they find out that bumblebees play with balls for enjoyment, just like human beings and dogs. And this adds to growing evidence that their minds are more complex than we have imagined. Look at them playing with those balls. I guess they could play soccer. This research provides a strong indication that insect minds are more sophisticated than we have imagined. And, you know, this is was based on a series of experiments. And in these experiments, bumblebees were found to repeatedly roll balls when given the option, despite no apparent incentive to do so. So what they believe is the bumblebees were doing it because it was fun. The repeated behavior suggesting ball rolling is rewarding for bumblebees. And so despite their tiny size and brains, these bumblebees are a lot more than small robotic beings. You know, the questions this raises in my mind is, I'm still not sure what a sentient being is. It's, I guess, a self-knowing being. Are bumblebees sentient? Do they know themselves? And if we thought that bumblebees were sentient, would this change how you think about them?
Well, there's a lot to learn about animal intelligence and whether it's hardwired or learned. And like they've done studies on honeybees, and honeybees actually serve an apprenticeship as they age and mature. They move from different jobs in the hive uh, as they go, and they try to figure out if the animal is behaving in a goal-oriented manner. So what they do is do damage to the work that the animal is doing, and then observe how it deals with the damage.
Uh-huh.
And it's really quite interesting. And the other interesting thing is within the animal group, there's always one or two that figure out the problem, like with the smarter animals that figure out the solution first.
That's the stars.
Well, and then, yeah, and then the rest watch and learn from copying the smart ones. And then
Uh-huh.
there's always a few, a small fraction, who never figure it out. And it would appear that there's this bell curve of ability within some animals,
Uh-huh.
just like there is within people. So it's an interesting area.
Interesting. It is not surprising. I had read about that bell curve also.
Yeah, like I read a thing on termites, and they said that a big fraction of the termites are ineffective in the work they do. And it's only 20 or 30% of the termite population that actually puts the little ball of mud in the right place.
Now, have you ever worked for a corporation?
Yeah. Pareto's rule,
Right.
20%, 20% do 80% of the work, but you never know which 20% are doing it.
That's right. I didn't realize it worked for termites too. It makes sense, I guess. Okay.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting is play has a big bearing on learning. And a lot of the higher animals, like foxes
Yes.
and wolves and stuff like that, the
Yes.
play is how they learn to become adults.
Yes. And one expression I read recently is that if you want to learn, then fuck around. And if you want to learn a lot, then fuck around a lot. And I hadn't heard it said that way, but I appreciate the idea. And I think that some of us may have done that ourselves. I see nodding heads, so,
Well,
okay.
that becomes possible when people have spare time beyond what they need just to survive.
Right, right. Which is one of the reasons most kids nowadays don't spend too much time surviving. So they can play on their device. It used to be with other people. Okay, now speaking of other people, the Chinese now are changing with their approach about childbirth. This article was started from an online post about newlyweds in China who was rung up by her local government asking after she was newly married if she was pregnant yet. This gathered thousands of comments, with many people saying they'd experienced similar calls. President Jinping has declared at the last party conference that China was going to establish a policy to boost birth rates and improve the country's population development strategy. Maybe this is a part of what he's doing. And the Post quoted colleagues as saying that she was told by an official of the local government that, quote, they want newlyweds to be pregnant within a year, and their target is to make a phone call every quarter. And the background problem is the disaster of the population changes in China. One part of that was from 1980 to 2015, the one-child policy. And new births are set this year to drop below 10 million from last year, which was 10.6 million. And that was a drop of about 12% from 2020. So the birth rate has been dropping extremely in China, and they're trying to deal with that. One thing that they're concerned about is that China's uncompromising zero COVID policies, with its strict controls on people's lives, they are seeing what they think may be lasting damage to the desires of families to have children. And so they're trying to do something about it. I have been friends with Chinese people, like in Hong Kong, and the idea that the Chinese don't want to have more children is just astounding to me, because their families are built so much around this that it just says what extreme fears and concerns they must have about their life to not want to have children.
Well, one of the things they find is people have fewer children when they become more rich and more secure.
Right.
And in the old days, your only security as you aged was to have lots of children, but that's no longer the case for the biggest fraction of people.
Right. Well, when you move to cities, when you're in the country, having more kids are workers, and you need them in the country for the farm. When you move to cities, kids are an expense.
The other problem is this aging demographic, and God only knows how that's going to turn out when more than half the population's over 80 years old.
That's right. I think they'll increase the retirement age. Okay, there we go. What do you have up, Chad?
Maybe
You're
on my
muted. You're muted. You're muted, Chad. It's a big, we don't know what it is, but we know it's a big change.
It's a big change. This is what happens when you go to church. The CO2 goes up, and then you get out of church, it goes back. So don't go to church if you want to avoid CO2.
Okay.
Or take your plants to church.
Yeah, carry them with you around your neck.
Okay.
I didn't really mean to put that up.
Okay, well, you did anyway, and it's okay. Now, I have a couple of health stories that are related. One of them is now what they're calling the COVID variant soup is making the winter surge harder to predict. Some people call it a swarm of variants. Some refer to it as a variant soup. what it means is now instead of having the particular variant, Delta, or the ones that we know about that have passed through, then this year there are lots of variants, and it's unprecedented in its diversity, and the complexity of it makes it harder to predict what's going to happen. It could even lead to a double wave in some places where first one variant, then another variant comes in. In Europe, North Africa, and North America and Africa, there's an Omicron offshoot in the BQ1 family that's rising quickly. In Asia, it's a lineage called the XBB. These are just the two most popular of more than a dozen that they have identified now. I have a chart of this. And so this shows where COVID began, then it went through Delta and Delta Plus, and then we had Alpha and Gamma and Omicron became BA1 and BA2, and BA2 became BA4 and BA5, and now we have a bunch of new ones, too many to have on the chart, and the COVID virus is doing well enough, occupying human body, that it is multiplying and diversifying, and we don't really know where it is going. One thing that a lot of these varieties have in common is mutations in the spike protein. That spike protein is also the target of a lot of antibodies, so these mutations make them maybe more resistant to the antibodies. And they say because there are these two main varieties in this swarm coming around, that it's possible that the BQ1 will cause a space and then be followed by an XBB making another spike. And, these don't seem to be as severe. They still don't understand why, but it just shows how this pandemic is continuing to change and develop as these fast mutating viruses do their mutation jobs.
It's also like viruses can actually evolve faster than we can develop the vaccines to deal with them.
Yep.
Unlike bacteria don't evolve quite as quickly as viruses do.
Right. Well, the viruses have a big advantage over the bacteria because they hijack our DNA to make more viruses.
Yeah. And I saw something that Pfizer was talking about selling the vaccine doses now, and
Yes.
they're going to be like $150 per
Right.
dose.
Right.
And so you wonder, how much did the governments pay Pfizer and Moderna and these people?
They were paying $30 a dose is what I understand.
Okay. But soon there's going to be more viruses than there are doses and vaccines. So then what?
Well, that's what the next story is about a little bit. Then now in China, they have actually put in production and are starting to use the first oral vaccine. It's through the mouth. They're using it as a booster for previously vaccinated people, and they hope the needle-free vaccines will make the vaccines more accessible, first for countries with fragile health systems, because it's easier to administer something that they take as an oral dose than it is to give them shots. The reports is it doesn't taste bad. One woman who had it said it was like drinking a cup of milk tea. It tasted a bit sweet. Now, the effectiveness of these non-needle vaccines has not been fully explored, so they're still doing that kind of testing. This inhalable vaccine was developed by the Chinese biopharmaceutical CanSino, and it's an aerosol version of the company's one-shot adeno vaccine, which uses a relatively harmless cold vaccine. Now, regulators in India have approved nasal vaccines squirted in the nose. This was developed in the U.S. and licensed to the Indian vaccine maker Bharat Biotech, and there are about a dozen other nasal vaccines that are being tested globally. And again, one of the things I think about the nasal vaccines is they will provide increased immunity at the point of infection, which is the nose and upper respiratory system. And it turns out if that's where you apply the vaccines, that's where you get the best protection. So personally, I believe that these nasal vaccines will be an important part of the next generation of COVID vaccines. And we're starting to see roll out now.
An inhalable vaccine makes a lot of sense for a respiratory disease.
Yes. You know, one of the things we forget about this pandemic is we haven't been doing this very long. And so it takes a while to figure all this stuff out.
Yeah, so much of prior diseases are blood oriented as opposed to respiration oriented.
Uh-huh.
But the other thing on this will be they can just pump it into the air in elevators and shopping centers, and everybody will get the dose whether they want it or not.
Hey, you're right. You're right. Certainly, I've gone through places where they had like DDT foggers in India in crowd situations. So I guess we could have a inhalable COVID vaccine fogger.
When you used to go to Southeast Asia, the guy would walk down the aisle of the airport in the airplane, spraying DDT into the air to clean it up before you got off.
Right. I remember that too.
But the other thing that's likely to happen is these viruses are changing faster than we can create the necessary vaccines. So 10 years from now, you can expect that everyone is wearing a respirator and looks like Darth Vader with the everything you inhale will be through a actual filter.
But this is not new for vaccines. Vaccines have been doing this, or viruses have been doing this already for a while. So you'd have to wonder what makes it different. Maybe the wiping out the reservoirs that slowed on the planet that slowed the spread of the vaccines speed up this transmission.
Yeah, there's an element, we've made ourselves more vulnerable to viruses with the crowding in cities, that sort of thing.
That's right. We just need to get rid of half the people. You first. I'm just kidding.
We won't have to get rid of half the people. Mother Nature will figure it out.
Well, see, that's the Gaia theory. Okay, anyway, thank you guys for joining me today, and it seems like it was a good session. I'm sorry to be so argumentative, Andrew, but sometimes I am that way too. So anyway, I hope you know you have my good spirits and stuff like that, even if I argue with you.
No worries. I enjoy the discussions.
Good.
He
good.
deserved it. He deserved it anyway.
Okay. Thanks for standing up to me, Chad. Anyway, I'll see you next week, and thank you all for joining.
See you, Daryl.
See ya.
John. See you, buddy.